the dead of night, when most people sleep peacefully in their beds, Maria Santos held her breath and listened. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant sound could mean the difference between life and death. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal of her rifle, a weapon that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. For months, her neighbors had whispered behind her back. They called her crazy, paranoid, a woman who had lost her mind to fear. They rolled their eyes when she spoke of shadows moving in the darkness, of footsteps that didn't belong, of a presence that watched her home night after night. Even her own family began to doubt her sanity. But Maria knew what she had seen. She knew what she had heard. And on this particular night, as dawn approached and the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through her bedroom curtains, she would finally have proof that her vigilance had saved not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she loved. This is the true story of a woman whose so-called paranoia turned out to be the most rational response to a very real and deadly threat. A story that reminds us that sometimes the person everyone thinks is crazy is the only one who truly sees the danger lurking in the shadows. Maria Santos had always been a light sleeper, but it wasn't until she moved to the remote farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield that she truly understood what it meant to be alert. The old Victorian house sat on 40 acres of rolling hills and dense woods, a place where her late husband had dreamed of raising horses and growing old together. After his sudden death from a heart attack, Maria found herself alone in the house they had planned to fill with laughter and family gatherings. The first strange incident happened on a Tuesday night in early September. Maria had been living in the house for just 3 weeks when she woke to the sound of her dog, Rex, growling low and deep. The German Shepherd's hackles were raised as he stood at the bedroom window, staring out into the darkness. Maria quietly slipped out of bed and peered through the curtains. The motion sensor lights that illuminated the driveway and front yard were dark, which meant nothing had triggered them. Yet Rex continued to growl, his body tense and ready to spring into action. She watched for nearly an hour, but saw nothing unusual. The next morning, she found footprints in the soft earth near her vegetable garden. They were large, made by work boots, and they circled the house in a deliberate pattern. When she mentioned this to her neighbor, Bill Henderson, who lived a mile down the road, he suggested it might have been a delivery driver who got lost in the dark. But Maria knew better. She had lived in cities all her life before moving to the countryside, and she understood the difference between innocent confusion and purposeful surveillance. These footprints were too methodical, too careful. Someone had been watching her house, studying it, learning its layout and routine. Over the next few days, more signs appeared. Her mailbox, which she always closed tightly, was found open several mornings in a row. The lock on her garden shed had been tampered with, though nothing was missing. Most disturbing of all, she began to notice that items in her house were slightly out of place. A kitchen chair pushed back from the table when she was certain she had pushed it in. A book on her nightstand turned to a different page. Her coffee cup moved from the left side of the sink to the right. Maria called the local police department and spoke to Officer Danny Martinez. She had known Danny since he was a child, as he was the son of her late husband's best friend. Danny listened patiently to her concerns, but explained that without clear evidence of breaking and entering or theft, there wasn't much the police could do. He promised to have patrol cars drive by her property more frequently, but Maria could hear the doubt in his voice. She realized that even Danny, who had known her for years, was beginning to question whether grief and isolation were affecting her judgment. Her sister Carmen visited from the city the following weekend. Carmen was a successful lawyer, practical and logical, and she had never approved of Maria's decision to stay in the remote farmhouse. As they sat on the front porch drinking coffee, Maria tried to explain what had been happening. Carmen listened with growing concern, but not the kind Maria had hoped for. "Maria, honey, you've been through so much trauma," Carmen said gently. "Losing Roberto, moving to this isolated place, being alone for the first time in 30 years. It's completely natural for your mind to be playing tricks on you. Maybe you should consider talking to someone, a counselor who specializes in grief." Maria felt a flash of anger, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm not imagining this, Carmen. Someone is watching this house. Someone has been inside." Carmen reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. "Even if that were true, which I'm not saying it is, don't you think the smart thing would be to sell this place and move back to the city? You could buy a nice condo near me, somewhere safe with security and neighbors close by." But Maria had no intention of abandoning the home she and Roberto had chosen together. This was where she planned to honor his memory and build the life they had dreamed of. She wouldn't be driven away by fear, and she certainly wouldn't be dismissed as a grieving widow who couldn't tell reality from imagination. That night, After Carmen returned to the city, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She went to the gun safe that Roberto had installed in their bedroom closet and removed his hunting rifle, a bolt-action Remington 700 that he had used for deer hunting. She had learned to shoot years ago when they were first married, and Roberto had insisted that she know how to handle firearms safely. She hadn't touched a gun since his death, but the familiar weight of the rifle in her hands brought back muscle memory and confidence. She loaded the rifle and placed it beside her bed, within easy reach. Rex seemed to approve of this decision, settling down on the floor next to her with a contented sigh. For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a sense of control over her situation. She wasn't helpless, and she wasn't crazy. She was a woman protecting her home and her life with the tools at her disposal. The pattern of surveillance continued for the next 2 weeks. Every few nights, Rex would alert her to something moving outside. Sometimes, she would see a shadow that didn't match the movement of trees and the wind. Other times, she would hear the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel or the distant sound of a car engine starting up in the woods beyond her property line. She began keeping a detailed log of these incidents, noting the time, weather conditions, and exactly what she observed. During the day, she installed additional security measures. She bought a trail camera and positioned it to monitor the approach to her house from the main road. She replaced the bulbs in her motion sensor lights with brighter ones and adjusted their sensitivity settings. Most importantly, she began varying her daily routine, leaving the house at different times and returning by different routes, making it harder for anyone to predict her movements. Her neighbors' reactions to these precautions were mixed. Bill Henderson thought she was being sensible, given that she was a woman living alone in an isolated area. But other neighbors were less supportive. Margaret Walsh, who lived closest to town, started spreading rumors that Maria was becoming unstable and potentially dangerous. Word spread that she was sleeping with a loaded rifle and had turned her home into an armed compound. The gossip reached her family, and Carmen called several times, expressing concern about Maria's state of mind. Even her grown children, who lived in other states, began calling more frequently, asking pointed questions about her mental health and suggesting that she might need professional help. Maria realized that the more she tried to convince people of the threat she was facing, the more they believed she was losing her grip on reality. The situation reached a breaking point 3 weeks later. Maria was in town buying groceries when she overheard 2 women talking in the pharmacy. They were discussing her situation, and one of them mentioned that they were considering calling Adult Protective Services to have her evaluated. The woman suggested that Maria might be a danger to herself and others, living alone with weapons while clearly suffering from delusions. Maria left the store without completing her shopping and drove home in a state of rage and desperation. She realized that she was facing 2 enemies now, the unknown person who was stalking her property, and a community that was ready to brand her as mentally unstable. If she was wrong about the threat, she would lose her credibility and possibly her independence. But if she was right, and she did nothing, she might lose her life. That evening, she called Danny Martinez one more time. She told him about the trail camera footage that showed the same figure approaching her property on multiple occasions, always at night, always staying just at the edge of the camera's range. She explained that she had documented dozens of incidents over the past month, and that the pattern of surveillance was becoming more frequent and more bold. Danny listened more seriously this time. He had known Maria's late husband well, and he remembered her as a sensible, level-headed woman. He agreed to come out to the house the next day to review her evidence and assess the situation professionally. For the first time in weeks, Maria felt a glimmer of hope that someone in authority might finally take her seriously. But as she prepared for bed that night, rifle within arm's reach and Rex alert at her feet, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The surveillance had been going on for over a month now, and whoever was watching her was getting bolder and more confident. The footprints were appearing closer to the house. The disturbances were happening more frequently. Whatever this person was planning, Maria sensed that it was about to happen soon. She settled into her usual position, sitting up in bed with her back against the headboard, rifle across her lap, and her eyes fixed on the window. Rex had positioned himself so he could watch both the bedroom door and the window simultaneously. They had become a team, woman and dog united in their vigilance against a threat that everyone else refused to acknowledge. As the hours passed and the house grew quiet around her, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since Roberto's death. She had gone from being half of a partnership to being completely alone, from living in a world she understood to facing a situation that defied easy explanation. But she had also discovered a strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. She would not be driven from her home by fear, and she would not be dismissed as a paranoid widow who couldn't distinguish between grief and reality. The rifle felt solid and reassuring in her hands. She had checked and rechecked the ammunition, practiced loading and unloading until she could do it by feel in the dark. She knew every sound her old house made as it settled for the night, every pattern of shadows cast by the trees outside her windows. She was as prepared as she could be for whatever was coming. And deep in her bones, Maria knew that something was definitely coming. The question was no longer whether she was imagining the threat, but when it would finally reveal itself and what she would have to do to survive it. The night, everything changed, started like any other in the past month. Maria settled into her bedtime routine at 10:30, checking all the doors and windows, setting the security system Roberto had installed but never had to use, and positioning her rifle within easy reach. Rex took his usual spot on the floor beside the bed, his ears perked and ready to alert her to any unusual sounds. Officer Danny Martinez had visited that afternoon, and for the first time since this ordeal began, Maria felt like someone in authority was taking her seriously. Danny had reviewed her detailed logs, examined the trail camera footage, and walked the perimeter of her property to see the evidence firsthand. The footprints, the disturbed vegetation, the signs of someone systematically observing her home were impossible to dismiss when viewed all together. "Maria, I owe you an apology," Danny had said as they stood in her kitchen reviewing the documentation. "This isn't the behavior of someone who's confused or grieving. This is stalking, and it's escalating. I'm going to file an official report and request increased patrols in this area. I want you to call me immediately if anything else happens, no matter how small it seems." For the first time in weeks, Maria had felt vindicated. Her vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was survival instinct. Her preparations weren't the actions of an unstable mind. They were the reasonable precautions of a woman who recognized danger and refused to be a victim. But validation brought its own anxiety. If the threat was real, as Danny now acknowledged, then her nightly vigils weren't just about proving her sanity anymore. They were about staying alive. Around midnight, Rex lifted his head and let out a low, almost inaudible growl. Maria's eyes snapped open immediately. She had been dozing lightly, her hand still resting on the rifle stock. This was how she slept now, never fully unconscious, always ready to respond to danger. Rex's growl was different tonight, more urgent, more focused than his usual alerts. Maria sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise that might mask whatever Rex was hearing. She listened intently, straining her ears for any sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the night. At first she heard nothing unusual. The old house creaked softly as it settled. Wind moved through the oak trees outside her window. Somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate. Then she heard it. The soft scrape of a shoe against the wooden steps of her front porch. Maria's heart began to race, but her hands remained steady as she lifted the rifle. This was what she had been preparing for. The moment when all her vigilance and precautions would be put to the test. She had visualized this scenario dozens of times over the past month, planning her response, considering her options, preparing mentally for the confrontation she knew was coming. Another step on the porch, this one more confident. Whoever was out there was no longer trying to move silently. Maria could hear the deliberate footsteps of someone who had decided that stealth was no longer necessary. Rex was fully alert now, his body coiled and ready to spring. But he remained silent on Maria's hand signal. She had trained him over the past weeks to wait for her command before reacting to intruders. The footsteps moved across the porch toward the front door. Maria heard the soft rattle of the door handle being tested. The sound sent a chill down her spine because it meant this person was no longer content to simply watch and wait. They were ready to enter her home. Maria had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. She knew exactly what she would do. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped out of bed and positioned herself at the bedroom window that gave her a clear view of the front porch. The motion sensor lights should have activated when the intruder approached the house, but they remained dark. Maria realized that whoever was out there had disabled or avoided the sensors, which meant they had studied her security measures carefully. Through the window, she could see a dark figure crouched by her front door. The person appeared to be working on the lock, using some kind of tool to try to gain entry. Maria could see enough to determine that the intruder was a man, tall and wearing dark clothing, but she couldn't make out any other details in the dim light. This was the moment of decision. Maria could call 911 and wait for help to arrive, knowing that the nearest police station was 20 minutes away and that by the time officers reached her remote location, this man could have accomplished whatever he came here to do. Or she could take action herself, using the skills and tools she had prepared for exactly this situation. Maria made her choice. Moving with the quiet confidence that comes from weeks of practice, she opened the bedroom window just wide enough to provide a clear line of sight to the front porch. She positioned the rifle on the windowsill, using the frame to steady her aim. and called out in a strong, clear voice that carried through the night air. "Stop what you're doing and step away from my door. I have a rifle aimed at you, and I will shoot if you don't leave my property immediately." The effect was instantaneous. The figure at the door froze for a moment, then spun around, clearly searching for the source of her voice. Maria could see him looking around frantically, trying to locate her position while also scanning for escape routes. "I can see you clearly," Maria continued, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I've been watching you for weeks, and I have evidence of every time you've been on my property. The police are already investigating, and they'll be here soon. Your best option is to leave now and never come back." The man took a step back from the door, but he didn't flee as Maria had hoped. Instead, he seemed to be calculating his options, weighing the risk of her threat against whatever had motivated him to come here tonight. Maria realized with growing alarm that he might not be deterred by the knowledge that she was armed and ready to defend herself. "Lady, you don't want to do this," the man called out, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "Put the gun down and we can work this out like civilized people. I'm not here to hurt you." Maria almost laughed at the absurdity of his words. A man who had been stalking her property for weeks, who had broken into her house to move things around and make her question her sanity, who was now attempting to break down her front door in the middle of the night, was trying to convince her that his intentions were peaceful. "If you're not here to hurt me, then explain why you've been watching my house for a month," Maria replied. "Explain why you've been inside my home without permission. Explain why you're trying to break in at 1 a.m. The man was silent for a long moment. Maria could see him shifting his weight, still calculating his next move. She kept the rifle trained on his center mass, knowing that if he made any sudden movement toward the door or tried to approach her window, she would have to fire. "You've got it all wrong," he finally said. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect you." The words sent a chill through Maria that was worse than outright threats would have been. She had dealt with enough manipulative people in her life to recognize gaslighting when she heard it. This man was trying to make her doubt her own perceptions, to convince her that his stalking behavior was somehow for her benefit. "Protect me from what?" she asked, though she had no intention of believing whatever story he might invent. "From people who want to hurt you. People who think you have something that belongs to them." Maria felt a moment of confusion. She had no idea what this man could be talking about. She and Roberto had lived simple lives. They had no enemies, no hidden wealth, no secrets that would make her a target for criminals. But she didn't let her confusion show in her voice. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care," she said firmly. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property before I start shooting." The man seemed to realize that his attempt at manipulation wasn't working. Maria saw him look around once more, assessing his situation. He was exposed on the front porch with no cover, facing a woman who clearly knew how to handle a rifle and had the high ground advantage from her second-floor window. Whatever he had planned for tonight, it hadn't included armed resistance from his intended victim. But instead of retreating, he made a decision that would haunt Maria for months to come. He reached into his jacket and pulled out what appeared to be a handgun. The sight of the weapon changed everything in Maria's mind. This was no longer a situation that might be resolved through intimidation or negotiation. This had become a matter of life and death. "Drop the gun," Maria commanded, her finger moving to the rifle's trigger. "Drop it now, or I will shoot you." The man didn't drop his weapon. Instead, he began moving toward the front door again, apparently betting that Maria wouldn't actually pull the trigger. He was gambling that she was bluffing, that despite all her preparations and warnings, she didn't have the resolve to actually shoot another human being. He was wrong. Maria had spent the past month not just preparing physically for this confrontation, but mentally as well. She had thought long and hard about what she would do if faced with a life-or-death situation. She had concluded that her life, and the life Roberto had wanted her to live, was worth defending with whatever force was necessary. When the man took his third step toward the door, gun still in his hand, Maria squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report shattered the quiet night like thunder. The man cried out and stumbled backward, dropping his weapon as he clutched his shoulder. Maria had aimed to wound rather than kill, but she was prepared to fire again if necessary. "Stay down," she commanded, already working the bolt to chamber another round. "Don't try to reach for your gun." The man was on the ground now, moaning in pain but still conscious. Maria could see blood spreading across his shirt, but the wound didn't appear to be life-threatening. She had accomplished exactly what she intended, stopping the threat without becoming a killer. Rex was barking now, adding his voice to the chaos of the moment. Maria could hear cars starting up in the distance, probably neighbors who had been awakened by the gunshot. She realized that her ordeal was about to become very public, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of what people would think. With her free hand, she grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911. "This is Maria Santos at 1247 Old Mill Road," she said when the dispatcher answered. "I've just shot an armed intruder who was trying to break into my home. The man is wounded but alive. I need police and an ambulance immediately." As she waited for help to arrive, Maria kept the rifle trained on the wounded intruder. He wasn't going anywhere with a bullet in his shoulder, but she had learned not to underestimate people who meant her harm. The man lay on her front porch, occasionally groaning in pain but no longer attempting to reach his dropped weapon. Within 15 minutes, the night was filled with flashing lights and sirens. Police cars, an ambulance, and even a fire truck responded to the call. Officer Danny Martinez was among the first to arrive, and he quickly took control of the scene. Maria could see the mixture of relief and admiration in his eyes as he looked up at her window. "You did good, Maria," he called up to her. "You can put the rifle down now. We've got this under control." As Maria finally lowered her weapon, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving her shaky but triumphant. She had trusted her instincts, prepared for the worst, and when the moment came, she had defended herself successfully. The wounded intruder was loaded into the ambulance and taken to the hospital under police guard. Before he left, however, Danny Martinez managed to get his name and some initial information that would shock Maria and vindicate her completely. The man was Thomas Crane, a career criminal with a long history of home invasions, sexual assaults, and violence against women who lived alone. According to preliminary investigation, Crane had been watching Maria's house as part of a pattern he had established in rural areas throughout the region. He would identify isolated women, study their routines for weeks or months, then break in when he was confident they were vulnerable and alone. Maria had been his next intended victim, but her vigilance and preparation had turned his planned attack into his capture. As dawn approached and the last of the emergency vehicles left her property, Maria sat on her front porch with Rex beside her, watching the sun rise over the hills she and Roberto had loved so much. The bullet hole in her porch railing and the bloodstains on the wooden floor were reminders of the night's violence, but they were also proof that she had survived something that might have destroyed her. The woman who had been dismissed as paranoid and unstable had saved her own life through preparation, awareness, and the courage to act when action was necessary. The rifle that everyone had said she shouldn't have had been the tool that preserved her safety and brought a dangerous criminal to justice. Maria knew that people would view her differently now. The gossip and doubt would be replaced by respect and perhaps a little fear. But she didn't care what anyone thought anymore. She had faced her worst nightmare and emerged victorious. She had honored Roberto's memory by refusing to be a victim, and she had proven that sometimes the person everyone thinks is crazy is actually the sanest one in the room. The morning after the shooting brought a parade of visitors to Maria's farmhouse that continued for days. The first to arrive was Detective Sarah Chen from the county sheriff's office, a serious woman in her 40s who specialized in crimes against women and had been tracking Thomas Crane for over 2 years. Detective Chen sat at Maria's kitchen table, surrounded by evidence bags and case files, painting a picture of the man Maria had shot that was far worse than anyone had initially realized. Thomas Crane wasn't just a common burglar or even a typical home invader. He was a methodical predator who had perfected a system of psychological torture that he used to break down his victims before he attacked them. "Mrs. Santos, what you experienced over the past month is something we call seasoning," Detective Chen explained, her voice gentle but professional. Crane would select isolated women, usually widows or divorcees living alone, and then spend weeks or months slowly invading their lives. He would move things in their homes, leave subtle signs of his presence, and gradually escalate his surveillance until his victims began to doubt their own sanity. Maria listened with growing horror as the detective described Crane's pattern. He would often succeed in convincing his victims' families and communities that they were suffering from mental health issues brought on by grief or isolation. By the time he was ready to strike, his targets were often completely isolated, with no one believing their reports of suspicious activity. In at least 6 cases we know of, women actually committed themselves to psychiatric facilities because they couldn't convince anyone that they were being stalked. Detective Chen continued. Crane would wait until they were institutionalized, then rob their homes at his leisure. But we suspect that in other cases, women who never got that far became his victims in ways we're still investigating. The detective opened a thick file folder and spread crime scene photos across the table. Maria had to look away from some of them, but she forced herself to study the evidence. These were photos from houses where Crane's other victims had lived. In each case, she could see the same subtle signs she had noticed in her own home. Items moved slightly out of place, evidence of someone going through personal belongings, signs that someone had been living in the shadows of these women's lives. What made you different was your response, Detective Chen said with obvious admiration. Most of Crane's victims either ignored the early warning signs or, when they did report them, they backed down when people didn't believe them. You trusted your instincts, you documented everything, and most importantly, you prepared to defend yourself. The detective explained that Crane's arrest had broken open multiple cold cases across 3 states. Physical evidence found in his apartment linked him to at least 12 home invasions, 3 sexual assaults, and 2 murders. The women he had killed had both lived alone in rural areas, and both had tried to report suspicious activity to local police in the weeks before their deaths. If you hadn't stopped him when you did, Detective Chen said quietly, I have no doubt that you would have become his next murder victim. The gun we recovered from your porch was the same weapon used to kill Sarah Mitchell in Tennessee last year. Maria felt a chill run through her as she realized how close she had come to becoming another statistic. But she also felt a profound sense of satisfaction knowing that her actions had not only saved her own life but potentially saved other women who might have become Crane's future victims. The news media attention that followed was intense but largely positive. Within days of the shooting, Maria found herself being interviewed by local television stations, newspapers, and even some national media outlets. The story of the paranoid widow who turned out to be completely right captured public attention and sparked conversations about how society treats women who report feeling unsafe. Her sister Carmen was among the first family members to call after the news broke. The conversation was awkward at first, with Carmen struggling to find words for the apologies she knew she owed. Maria, I am so sorry, Carmen said, her voice thick with emotion. When you tried to tell me what was happening, I should have listened. I should have supported you instead of suggesting you needed therapy. But Maria surprised herself by feeling no anger toward her sister or anyone else who had doubted her. Carmen, you reacted the way any reasonable person would react, she said calmly. What was happening to me was so far outside normal experience that it made sense to question it. The important thing is that I trusted myself even when no one else did. The conversation with her grown children was similarly emotional. Both of her sons had been planning to stage an intervention before the shooting occurred, convinced that their mother was having a mental health crisis that required professional treatment. Learning that their mother had actually been in mortal danger and that she had successfully defended herself against a serial killer was a shock that took time to process. Mom, we're so proud of you, her youngest son David said during a tearful phone call. But we're also scared by how close we came to losing you. If you hadn't been prepared, if you hadn't trusted your instincts. Maria reassured her children that she was safe now, but she also made it clear that she had no intention of changing her lifestyle or leaving the farmhouse. If anything, the experience had strengthened her connection to the home she had shared with Roberto and her determination to live life on her own terms. The legal proceedings that followed were surprisingly straightforward. The shooting was quickly ruled justified self-defense, with overwhelming evidence supporting Maria's account of events. Thomas Crane, recovering from his shoulder wound in a prison hospital, eventually pled guilty to multiple charges including attempted breaking and entering, stalking, and weapons violations. The plea bargain was designed to avoid a lengthy trial while ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for his other crimes. During the sentencing hearing, Detective Chen read a statement that Maria had written for the court. In it, she described not just the terror of being stalked and the trauma of having to shoot another human being, but also the additional pain of being disbelieved and dismissed by people she had counted on for support. The most difficult part of this experience wasn't the fear, Maria had written. It was the isolation that came from having people I trusted treat my legitimate concerns as symptoms of mental illness. I hope that my story will encourage others to take women's safety concerns seriously, even when they seem unusual or difficult to believe. The statement had a powerful impact in the courtroom and beyond. Several advocacy groups for women's safety reached out to Maria, asking her to speak at conferences and workshops about trusting intuition and preparing for personal protection. She accepted some of these invitations, finding purpose in sharing her story with women who might benefit from her experience. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her local community. Bill Henderson organized a neighborhood gathering at Maria's house, ostensibly to celebrate her recovery but really to acknowledge that they had failed her when she needed support most. Nearly 50 neighbors attended, including many who had dismissed her as paranoid or unstable. Margaret Walsh, who had been among the most vocal critics of Maria's behavior, made a public apology that brought tears to many eyes. "Maria, I was wrong about you, and I'm ashamed of the way I talked about you to others," she said. "You showed courage and wisdom when the rest of us showed ignorance and prejudice. I hope you can forgive us." Maria accepted the apologies graciously, but she also used the opportunity to educate her neighbors about the reality of stalking and violence against women. She explained that what had happened to her was not as unusual as they might think, and that dismissing women's safety concerns could literally be a matter of life and death. "I don't want your guilt," she told the assembled group. "I want your commitment to believe women when they say they feel unsafe, and to support them in taking whatever precautions they think are necessary." The gathering ended with several neighbors asking Maria to teach them basic home security measures and firearms safety. She agreed, and these informal classes became a regular event that brought the community together while providing practical skills that could save lives. Officer Danny Martinez became a regular visitor to the farmhouse, stopping by for coffee and conversation as part of his increased patrols in the area. During one of these visits, he brought news that provided the final piece of the puzzle that had been Maria's nightmare. "We figured out how Crane first targeted you," Danny explained. "He was working part-time for a moving company that handled estate sales and house clearances. When your husband died, the company was hired to remove some furniture and belongings that you couldn't handle yourself. Crane saw the paperwork, realized you were a recent widow living alone in an isolated area, and marked you as a potential target." The revelation was both disturbing and oddly comforting. It explained how Crane had known so much about her situation and her vulnerability. It also proved that his selection of her had nothing to do with anything she had done wrong or any way she had made herself a target through careless behavior. He had access to information about dozens of women in similar situations, Danny continued. "You were just the one he decided to focus on. But you were also the one who fought back successfully." As autumn turned to winter, Maria settled into a new routine that incorporated the lessons she had learned from her ordeal. She maintained the security measures she had installed, continued her target practice at the local gun range, and kept detailed records of anything unusual around her property. But she also returned to many of the activities that had given her joy before Crane entered her life. She resumed her gardening, started volunteer work with a local literacy program, and even began dating a widower she met through her church. Her rifle still sat beside her bed each night, and Rex still slept on the floor ready to alert her to any disturbance. But these precautions no longer felt like symptoms of paranoia. They felt like reasonable preparations for a woman who had learned to trust her instincts and protect her independence. The anniversary of the shooting was marked by a visit from Detective Chen, who brought news that Crane had died in prison, apparently from complications related to his untreated diabetes. Maria felt no satisfaction in learning of his death, but she did feel a sense of closure. The man who had terrorized her and so many other women would never hurt anyone again. "You saved more lives than you'll probably ever know," Detective Chen told her as they sat on the same front porch where Maria had faced down her attacker. "The evidence we gathered from Crane's case helped us solve other crimes and put other predators in prison. Your courage to fight back had ripple effects that are still being felt." Maria looked out over the hills that she and Roberto had loved, now painted in the brilliant colors of autumn. The bullet hole in her porch railing had been repaired, but she had kept a small piece of the damaged wood as a reminder of the night that changed everything. Not a reminder of trauma, but a reminder of strength, preparation, and the importance of trusting yourself even when the whole world tells you that you're wrong. She had been called paranoid for sleeping with a rifle and preparing for danger that no one else could see. But when dawn came after that terrible night and the truth was finally revealed, it became clear that her so-called paranoia had been the most rational response possible to a very real and deadly threat. The woman who had been dismissed as crazy had been the sanest person in the room all along. And in trusting herself completely when it mattered most, she had not only saved her own life, but helped protect countless other women from a predator who might otherwise have continued his reign of terror indefinitely. Maria Santos had learned that sometimes the person everyone thinks is paranoid is actually the only one who truly sees the danger lurking in the shadows. And sometimes, clutching a rifle through the long dark hours of the night is not a sign of madness, but a sign of wisdom that could mean the difference between life and death when morning finally comes.